Clara Prescott hadn't been back to Meadowridge in over a decade. The old Prescott mansion, with its Gothic towers rising against the grey sky, looked even more ominous than she remembered. The cold wind cut her face like a silent warning, and the letter in her hand, summoning her for the reading of her father Charles Prescott's will, felt as heavy as the family legacy itself. But this time, she had no choice. The letter had brought her back, and she knew that what lay ahead could change everything. As she climbed the creaking steps, Clara felt the familiar unease that the house always brought. The air smelled of wet leaves and moss, mixed with a touch of decay and mold clinging to the old wooden walls. For a moment, she wondered if the house had grown darker, as if years of secrets had made the place even more oppressive. The front door opened with a guttural groan, and the old housekeeper, Martha, appeared, her face etched with years of service. Her eyes, heavy with untold secrets, scrutinized Clara with an intensity that made her hesitate. It was as if Martha knew more than anyone else, each glance carrying a deep foreboding. Every step Clara took down the dim hallway echoed, reminding her that the past never truly rested. The portraits of old Prescotts on the walls seemed alive, their painted eyes following her every move, watchful and judgmental. People said the family fortune was built on buried tragedies and secrets, and Clara knew the house's air of mystery was more than just superstition. When Clara finally entered the living room, the shift in atmosphere was suffocating. Her mother, Elizabeth, sat with tense shoulders, gripping a lace handkerchief so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her older brother David looked like a statue, staring blankly ahead as if waiting for a verdict. The room was thick with silent expectation, as if the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to finally reveal the secrets buried so long ago. Crossing into the living room, Clara felt the oppressive weight of the mansion intensify. The air was thick with a stifling formality, where every detail seemed designed to remind everyone of the Prescott influence and legacy. The lingering scent of old lavender failed to mask something more sinister that had seeped into the walls. Elizabeth sat on one of the dark leather couches, her posture immaculate, shoulders tight under the elegant fabric of her black dress. Her pale hands gripped the lace handkerchief, twisting it in a way that betrayed an anxiety she tried hard to hide with her composed expression. She stared straight ahead, as if focusing on something that could keep her from breaking down. David, Clara's older brother, stood rigid by the unlit fireplace, his jaw clenched and gaze distant, his tension barely held in check. It was like he was a coiled spring, ready to snap, but he forced himself to stay still, as if his strength depended on not relaxing for even a second. The sense of something inevitable loomed over him. A shiver ran down Clara's spine, a sense of foreboding that made her question why she had come back at all. Martha, the housekeeper, remained by the door, watching with an intensity that went beyond mere service. There was something unsettling in her gaze, as though she knew secrets that refused to stay buried. The family lawyer, Mr. Carter, stood by a table scattered with documents, waiting for Clara's presence to begin. The sealed envelope containing Charles Prescott's will sat there in plain sight, visible to all but still holding answers just out of reach. The silence became so heavy it felt like even the house was holding its breath. Clara realized that this was just the beginning, and whatever the will revealed could be the catalyst to unearth all the sins of the past. The next morning, the Prescott mansion woke to a new horror. The sky was overcast, and a thick fog wrapped around the property, casting an eerie glow over everything. Clara awoke with an unexplainable sense of dread, as if the house itself was bracing for an unwanted revelation. The commotion started in the garden. Rushed footsteps, alarmed whispers, and Martha's muffled scream soon drew everyone's attention. Clara hurried down the stairs, her heart pounding, and followed the growing noise outside. What she found made the blood in her veins turn to ice. Mr. Carter's body lay sprawled in a patch of earth, his clothes soaked in blood, eyes wide and frozen in terror. The ground around him showed clear signs of a struggle, the soil churned up as if something had been violently unearthed or hastily buried again. Elizabeth and David were already there. Elizabeth held her hand over her mouth, the lace handkerchief now damp with silent tears. David seemed frozen, his jaw clenched, but this time his usual mask of control had slipped. Something in his eyes suggested more than shock, perhaps a dark recognition. The police were called, and soon investigators were combing the scene. Clara stood on the sidelines, watching as pieces of the past fit together in a way that unsettled her deeply. It wasn't just the murder that disturbed her, but the footprints that led away from the body, ending abruptly in a spot where the ground was clearly disturbed. Details emerged, each more troubling than the last. Near Mr. Carter's right hand, something glinted in the morning light, a necklace with a familiar pendant. Clara recognized it immediately, it belonged to Elizabeth. The discovery cast an even darker shadow over the family, making the tragedy painfully personal, impossible to ignore. The weight of the Prescott mansion's secrets was beginning to surface, and Clara felt that the house itself was at the center of everything. The promise of grim revelations hung in the air, ready to shatter any illusion of normalcy left. The afternoon settled over the Prescott mansion with a thick silence, as if even the wind feared breaking it. Clara stood in her father's study, a room that had been off-limits throughout her childhood. The dark wood shelves were crammed with ancient volumes, and the oak desk still held neatly arranged papers, as if Charles Prescott might return any moment to resume his unfinished work. The whispers of the ongoing police investigation echoed through the house, but Clara was lost in her own world, reliving memories she wished she could bury. The memory of the night that drove her from the mansion was like a wound that never fully healed, throbbing at the edges of her mind. But she couldn't ignore it now. The past refused to stay hidden. Her hands trembled as she opened a locked drawer. The cracked leather cover of Charles Prescott's diary felt sinister under her fingertips. A shiver ran down her spine as she flipped through the pages, the smell of aged paper mingling with the essence of long-held secrets. His writings ranged from reflections on the family fortune to mentions of a greater evil he feared. One particular entry made her pause. The accident involving a family member was something Charles had covered up to protect the Prescott name. The date lined up with when Clara had left the mansion, hitting her like a cold blow to the chest. The connection was undeniable. Whatever had happened that night, Charles knew, and he had protected her from something, or someone. Footsteps in the hallway made her look up, her heart racing. She quickly closed the diary and stashed it away. She realized that digging into the past was like reopening a wound that would never heal, but there was no time left to avoid it. The past was coming back, and maybe there was no escape. The tension in the Prescott mansion was so thick it felt like it could split in half. Twilight cast restless shadows through the hallways, and the air was heavy with the consequences of what had been uncovered in the garden. Clara was back in the living room, but now the weight of what she knew pressed down on her. Her father's diary burned in her mind, each word an ancient warning. Elizabeth stood by the window, the lace handkerchief still clutched in her trembling hand. Her eyes stared blankly outside, her expression carrying an unease Clara hadn't seen since Charles's death. Her mother had always been a fortress of composure, but now she seemed fragile, like a structure about to collapse. David, on the other hand, was more agitated than ever. He paced back and forth, his jaw tight, and his expression betrayed something deeper, fear. David despised losing control, and the situation was clearly slipping through his grasp. Clara wondered what he knew, or worse, what he was hiding. The fragile balance of the family, held together by years of secrets and lies, was cracking. Clara stepped toward Elizabeth, but before she could speak, a muffled scream echoed down the hall, freezing everyone in place. Martha, the housekeeper, burst into the room, her face ghostly pale. There was a raw, almost animal desperation in her eyes. It felt as if the house conspired to keep everyone trapped in its web of secrets. Clara's urgency spiked. The diary mentioned Charles protecting the family, but from whom? Or what? David stopped his pacing, his face etched with a mixture of anger and something closer to panic. He looked at Clara, and for a moment, something shifted between them. An unspoken understanding passed between them, something they both recognized but were too afraid to name. Time seemed to stand still. The house was alive with the promise of something terrible about to be unearthed, something that should never have been left in the dark. The sun was disappearing fast behind the hills, plunging the Prescott mansion into a sinister twilight. What had once been gentle shadows now turned into threatening figures, watching every move. Clara felt the air grow heavier with each passing minute, making every breath an effort. The police were back, this time with new evidence that changed everything. Their murmurs echoed through the house as they discussed the case in serious, hushed tones. Clara watched from a distance, her stomach churning as the sense of an impending end grew stronger. David sat near the fireplace, but his carefully constructed facade had crumbled. His hands visibly shook, and a bead of sweat ran down his temple. Clara noticed every detail, realizing the secret he had been hiding was finally breaking him. The chief of police approached, his expression serious. The room's tension was unbearable as he announced they had found something damning, David's fingerprint on the necklace found beside Mr. Carter's body. The necklace, which belonged to Elizabeth, was now undeniable proof that David was more involved in the lawyer's death than he had let on. David's eyes became wild, like a trapped animal. His voice cracked with desperation, and he began to speak, his confession coming out in jagged pieces. He talked about the pressure no one could understand, the obsession with protecting the family legacy, and the fear of everything Charles had built crumbling under the weight of their secrets. He admitted confronting Mr. Carter when he learned about a clause in the will that could ruin the Prescotts. His fear had turned to blind rage, and when the lawyer threatened to expose the truth, the fragile line between control and chaos snapped. Elizabeth collapsed into a chair, her lace handkerchief falling from her grasp. Clara felt a cold pain pierce her heart. Everything was unraveling like a house of cards, and the secrets Charles had tried to protect were now tearing the family apart. The mansion seemed almost satisfied, having witnessed generations of sins, embracing the tragedy it had long harbored. The silence that followed David's confession felt like a vacuum, draining all life from the room. Clara felt the crushing weight of everything that had happened, as though the mansion itself was closing in around her. Elizabeth couldn't lift her head, her shoulders slumped under the unbearable burden of watching her family collapse. David was taken away in handcuffs, the metal glinting in the last of the day's light. His eyes met Clara's for a brief moment, and beyond the desperation in his gaze, there was a dark kind of relief. The secrets were finally out, but the price was unimaginable. As night fully fell, the Prescott mansion felt emptier than ever, a hollow shell that once held the family's grandeur. Clara slowly climbed the stairs to her old bedroom, each creaking step like a mournful cry. When she entered, the silence was almost tangible, and she sensed a presence she couldn't explain. She held Charles Prescott's diary once more, rereading the cryptic notes about a greater evil he had feared. Clara realized there were still things in the past that hadn't come to light. Her father had tried to protect the family from something, but what exactly? The mystery still lingered in the mansion, refusing to disappear even with David's arrest. Clara looked out the window at the garden where Mr. Carter's body had been found. A creeping fog began to spread over the grounds, as if the earth itself wanted to hide its secrets once more. She wondered if the Prescott mansion would ever truly rest or if it would continue to whisper its dark truths to anyone brave, or foolish, enough to listen.